If you ever feel stuck on how to tell what your listeners actually want from you in terms of what topics to talk about next or what guests to bring on your show, I'm going to let you in on a secret because your best episode topics are hiding out right now inside your listener data because your listeners leave clues. And inside this episode, I'm going to show you how to find them. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. So here's the thing that nobody tells you about your podcast analytics dashboard. Most hosts check it every week to see, okay, have my downloads increased? Do I have more listeners? And then they're disappointed to find, well, no, I have the same amount of downloads as I did last week. Maybe I have a couple more, maybe I have a couple less. But the reality is you can actually use the analytics on your podcast to grow your podcast when you know what to look for. The average podcast listener spends a whopping 7 hours a week glued to their favorite podcast app. So if you're not looking at your dashboard and taking note of what your listeners are telling you, you're missing out on a huge opportunity to attract more listeners to your show and to keep the ones you've got engaged simply by giving them more of what they're telling you that they want. Now, a lot of hosts will complain and say, well, podcasting feels kind of like a one-sided conversation because, people aren't giving me feedback on an episode. It's not the same as posting a video to Instagram and suddenly people comment or they're DMing you. But even if your numbers are small, listeners are engaging with your podcast. You just have to learn how to interpret the data to figure out what they're saying. So the next time you open your analytics dashboard, I want you to ask yourself, where are the clues that my listeners are giving me right now that I can start using to optimize my show? You're going to find them in 3 spots: your episode downloads, your episode completion rate, and your overall episode performance. Now, a lot of people get confused by all the data that a hosting platform like, let's say, Buzzsprout or Libsyn provides, because those types of platforms give you a lot of data to look at, and a lot of it's irrelevant. At least it's not relevant in terms of building a growth strategy for your podcast. Now, there's other data that we can look at too, specific to certain podcast players like Apple Podcasts Connect. But what most hosts do is they kind of forget that even exists and they just look at the data inside of their hosting platform and they're like, okay, well, I see that people are listening like in Zimbabwe and in the UK and in Canada, a few people, some people in the US, a couple in Australia, right? And they're like, what do I do with this data? People are listening on an iPhone, they're listening on an Android device, but that doesn't really tell me much about my listener. And the truth is, some of that data is never going to help you grow your podcast. It's totally useless. Yeah, it's interesting maybe to know what parts of the world you're reaching listeners. That's cool. But when it comes to podcast growth, you have to understand that different data sets are used for different functions of the podcast. So let's say that I, as the host, my goal this month or for this quarter or this year, whatever, was to increase engagement, just like you're learning how to do in this episode. Then I would use the 3 data points that I just gave you. And in a moment, I'll walk you through what to do with those: episode downloads, episode completion rate, and episode performance. But let's say you're tracking the month-over-month growth of your podcast. Well, there's a different data set that we would look at for that. Or if you're testing how many downloads do you need to rank in a specific category, there's a different data set that we would use for that. So as a host, part of it is knowing what the data means, and then it's knowing what data to use for what outcomes. And then the other side of this is knowing what data is okay to ignore. One of our coaches inside of Pod Launch used our methodology to launch her very first podcast 4 years ago. And currently she has 2 podcasts that are ranked among the top 100 podcasts in her niche globally. But what's really interesting about her first show is that about 1.5 years ago, she stopped publishing episodes to that show. That podcast was dark. She was going through a big business pivot, a big rebrand. She launched her second podcast, and she wasn't really sure what to do with the first podcast because the first podcast kept ranking. It kept bringing in listeners. It kept bringing in leads and clients to her evergreen program that was running in her business on autopilot. So she's like, I can't just ignore it completely. But also, this is crazy to me that this show is still getting the attention and the traction that it's getting. She said, no, I know a lot of that's thanks to the pod launch methodology and the strong foundation that we've built for the show. She said, but what I really noticed when I went in to look at the data, she said, there's one episode that is a real standout compared to the others, where that particular episode has like 6,000 downloads, one episode, single episode. Even though her podcast was dark for 1.5 years, people are still finding it. They're still listening to it. Now, by comparison, her other episodes had maybe around 800 downloads or so, but astronomically different because this one episode, oh my gosh, it was so obvious that episode was performing really well. And she said, I know the fact that my podcast continues to rank every week, even though I haven't published an episode to that podcast in over 18 months, is because of that one episode and the traction that it's bringing in. So this is a really big and obvious example of, okay, if that is happening for you, then we need to double down on that. We need to zero in on that. We need to look at what is it about that episode, or maybe it's a handful of episodes that are outperforming that you can tell just by the number of downloads or by the overall performance of those episodes over the first 7 days, that you can see, there's something telling here. And now we need to get really curious and say, okay, what is it that I can capitalize on to help attract more listeners to my podcast, to help put out more content like this? Maybe talk about it from a different angle or a different perspective, or bring on a guest to talk about it, because this is what my listeners are telling me that they want. So in our last coaches meeting, we sat down and we broke it down. We broke down this episode and we noticed the 4 things that this episode really hits the mark on. Number 1, it's very short. Number 2, it's very specific. Number 3, it's actionable, meaning that someone can listen to that episode and they can walk away and apply exactly what they learned and see a difference. And number 4, it had the relevant keywords stacked into that episode in the title, in the show notes, in order to attract listeners who were searching for that exact thing. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Not every episode is going to hit all 4 of these marks. There's going to be some episodes you put out that are longer than others. Not every good episode has to be short. But for her, this particular episode stands out because it was shorter than the rest. It was specific and actionable, and it had these keywords. Now, the other thing that I will tell you too is that not every single episode you put out is going to be super actionable. Even like on my podcast, there are going to be episodes that are there to educate. There are going to be episodes that are there to make you think differently, to give you a different perspective. And those are going to be equally powerful and equally valuable to the episodes where I'm saying, here's how to do this. So not every episode that stands out has to be actionable. But the 2 things that every single episode does need to hit the mark on, regardless of the length of the episode, or whether you're teaching something that's meant to be thought-provoking or perspective shifting versus something that is literally an action step that a listener can walk away with and do, is that it has to be specific and it has to use keywords that your listeners are already searching for. So for the remainder of this episode, what we're going to do is I'm going to have you, if you're in a place right now where you can do this, I want you to do this with me as you listen to this episode. Now, if you're driving or if you're at the gym or if you're walking the dogs or something, then bookmark this one, save it to come back to, because this is an exercise that you're going to want to do. And I'm curious to see what your results are when you do this exercise. So what I want you to do is I want you to open up both of your analytics dashboards. And when I say both, I mean the one that your hosting provider provides you. Let's just say it's Buzzsprout. So you would open up your Buzzsprout analytics dashboard. And I want you to log into your Apple Podcast Connect account. Now we're going to be looking at 2 different types of data from both of these platforms. I want you to ignore the overall number of downloads that your show has gotten. I want you to ignore the countries that your show is reaching listeners in. What we want to look at first is the episode downloads. And if you were to just look back at all episodes, and we're just looking at the cumulative number of all downloads for all the episodes that you have, I want you to notice if there are any particular episodes that have attracted more attention than other episodes. Whether it's massive attention, like in the case of Coach Catherine in this story that I just shared with you, or whether it's just a little bit more attention. Maybe it's 30 additional downloads. Maybe it's 100 additional downloads, but more downloads than the majority of your episodes tend to get. So I want you to take note of that, and I want you to write those episodes down. Okay, then you're going to go into your Apple Podcast Connect account. And what I want you to look at is which of your episodes listed in Apple Podcast Connect have the highest completion rates. And I want you to write those down. Notice at this point if any of those overlap with the ones that have more downloads. If they do, you are hitting on something there that your listeners really want. If they don't overlap, that's okay. It's still something that your listeners were interested in because more listeners were engaged with that episode. They listened longer. So we want to look at that completion rate. And then finally, I want you to look in Apple Podcast Connect at your episode performance. And what this is, Apple will actually chart a graph for you to show you over the first 7 days or 21 days or 30 days, whatever you set it to be. It will show you the traction that that episode has compared to the average episode and other episodes that were released around that time frame. So we were looking at this data one day. This was a couple of months back. And Immediately, there was an episode that was like off the charts in terms of 7-day downloads, in terms of like the graph that Apple provided. It was getting so much more traction than some of the other episodes. So I immediately went and I looked and I'm like, what was that episode about? And the title of that episode was, if your podcast isn't converting listeners to leads, this could be why. Chances are you listened to that episode. Maybe you remember it. If not, you might want to scroll back and listen to it because it has been one of the top performing episodes of our podcast in the recent past. So why are we looking at this data? Why is this important? Well, what this gives us is insight into our listeners' minds. Because, yeah, the podcast hosts who complain about listeners being not engaged and it's difficult to get engagement from listeners, they're right. To the extent that podcast listeners are a pretty passive audience. They're not there leaving comments. They're not there giving a thumbs up or hearting something or DMing you saying, oh my gosh, this was amazing. Thank you so much. Or I needed this. Or haha, this is so funny. I love this video, right? Like we're so used to that on social media. That doesn't happen in the podcast space. But what we want to look at is which episodes are they the most engaged with? Because that right there is an indicator that that's your best content. Those are your best episode topics. And they're hiding right there in your listener data. So then what you could do is you could do a couple of things from here. You can look at, okay, what are the most popular episode topics? And if you have a little bit of budget for your podcast, you could put some money behind them. These are episodes that you could begin to promote because you already have proof of concept. And we'll link up in the show notes to the tool that we like to use to promote top performing episodes so that it's compliant with the IAB guidelines. This is so important because we want real listeners listening to your podcast. And if real listeners are not listening, because yes, there are people on Fiverr and on Instagram who will try to pitch you and say, oh, I can help you get 10,000 downloads to your podcast. Please do not ever hire them because what they're going to do is they're going to hook up your podcast to a bot farm. And those bots, those robots, those AI tools are going to go in and quote unquote, listen to the first couple seconds of your episode. And Apple's going to know. And Apple's going to say, oh, this person's trying to game the system. No, we're going to shadow ban you and we are going to shut your podcast down. So please don't do that. But the tool that we're going to link to in the show notes is actually a reputable tool that operates only based on the IAB download standards. And what you want is to always make sure your podcast is in compliance with this. And this is also better for you as a host because that means that we're getting your show in front of real listeners, people who are likely to listen to your podcast, people who are likely to want to come back for more. So you've got proof of concept on these episodes, and that's something that you can begin to experiment with if you had a little bit of budget and you wanted to put some money behind it. But even if you didn't have a budget or you didn't want to put any money behind it, that's okay. What you can then do, and what you should do regardless, is for future episodes, iterate on these topics. Because those are topics that your listeners are literally telling you, based on their behavior, that they want more of. So you can approach those from different facets and different angles. You can bring guests on to talk about those topics. You can approach those topics in new and creative ways so that it's not repetitive. It doesn't get boring. It's not you talking about the same topic over and over necessarily, but it's you approaching that topic from different angles because A, it's something your listeners want. B, it's something you can easily deliver to your listeners. And C, because for the long-term growth of your podcast, it's going to help continue engaging listeners that are already interested in that topic and attracting new listeners who are also interested in that topic. So at this point, if you're sitting here and you're doing this exercise with me, chances are you've got a couple of episodes written down that are little golden threads that you can now pull for your future podcast content. And if you weren't able to do this exercise in real time, make sure to come back to it and do it because this is going to give you really valuable insight into your podcast. But what about if you're listening right now and you're like, okay, Courtney, this is cool and great, but I don't have any standout episodes. Well, that could be a sign that your messaging and your positioning is off for your podcast, which means that listeners are overlooking your podcast altogether. So if this is something that is happening for you right now and you're like, okay, I'm in the dashboard, I'm doing what you're telling me, but there are no episodes that are jumping out, or all of my episodes are getting like 10 downloads per episode. You know, some have 7, some have 8, some have 10. Like it's not enough of a difference to really say, oh, that's a standout topic. Then what I would encourage you to do is go to the show notes right now and book a call with my team. Let's sit down. Let's look at your podcast together. Let's look at where there might be gaps that you don't realize there are gaps that could be affecting your podcast ability to attract and keep and convert new listeners. Now, the other thing that this could mean is, number one, maybe you're not being specific enough in the topics that you're talking about, and that is something that you can continue testing. And it could also mean that you need to keep testing different topics in general, because sometimes there's going to be that one topic that really hits. And that's what we want to look for. Those are the golden threads that we want to pull. And the way we find them is to continually test new content and new things. Now, there are other things that you can also do with this specific data set: your episode downloads, your episode completion rate, and your episode performance. This can give you valuable insight into how long your episode should be. And I did an entire episode about how to figure that out, which I will link to in the show notes below. And there are some other things that you can look at too. But one of the biggest things that you want to be aware of when it comes to your podcast, and one of the easiest ways to attract and engage new listeners, is to be very specific in the problem that you solve and in the topics that you speak about. And this is something that a lot of people struggle with their podcasts. So in the next episode, I'm going to show you one way that you can start to make your podcast content more specific, hyper specific, and therefore hyper relevant and attractive to your listener. That's coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.